Where does the Kerouac story begin? It reaches beyond Lowell, as all of his biographers tell it. The first Kerouac ancestor to come to North America settled in Quebec along the St. Lawrence River in the early 1700s. His two sons began the two major branches of the Kerouac family tree in northeastern Canada and then southward into the United States. In 1890, Jean-Baptiste Kerouac, Jack's grandfather, emigrated with his family from the small Quebec village of St. Hubert to Nashua, New Hampshire. He built this house at 16 Pierce Street, where he and his wife, Clementine Bernier Kerouac, continued to raise the large family they had begun in Quebec, including their youngest son, Leo Alcide Kerouac, Jack's father. In his comings and goings around Nashua, Leo met Gabrielle Levesque when she was living in this boarding house at 101 Ash Street. Gabrielle had lost her mother while an infant and her father when she was 16. She lived in this house while working in a Nashua shoe factory. On October the 25th, 1915, Leo and Gabrielle were married at Nashua's St. Louis de Gonzague Catholic Church. The structure shown here is the only part that remains after the original church building was destroyed by fire in 1976. By now, Leo had a job working for a French-language newspaper in Lowell, Massachusetts, and he and Gabrielle moved there to begin their family. A son, Gerard, was born in 1916, and a daughter, Caroline, in 1918. Then, on March the 12th, 1922, their third and last child, Jean-Louis Jack Kerouac, was born in the upper level of this double-decker at No. 9 Lupine Road in the Centerville section of Lowell. In his novel Dr. Sachs, Jack would write that his birth took place at 5 o'clock in the afternoon of a red all-over supper time. After Jack's birth, the Kerouacs would make numerous moves in the Centerville and Pawtucketville French-Canadian neighborhoods. When Jack was 3 years old, the family moved from Lupine Road to here at 35 Burnaby Street, just a few blocks away. But it was a move just a year after that one, to 34 Boyer Street, that would provide the 4-year-old Jack with an incident he would barely remember, but which would still haunt him throughout his life, and provide the setting for his novel, Visions of Gerard, Jack's tribute to his older brother. This intersection of Lily, Aiken, and West 6th Streets is referred to in Visions of Gerard as the central point of the Centerville neighborhood. One story in that novel is of young Gerard walking to a drugstore on this corner on a very cold night to get some aspirin for his mother's severe headache. The center of French-Canadian social life in this neighborhood was a Centerville Social Club, still in operation, as shown here. It was a neighborhood gathering place and a place to reminisce about the old country of Quebec. The Kerouacs were communicants at the St. Louis de France Church, which is 1 block over from the Boyer Street home. This is the church where Jack was baptized. Jack and Gerard attended the St. Louis de France School, right next to the church in their early grades. The school is still in operation as a Catholic grade school and looks practically the same as it did when Jack and Gerard attended. The building to the left of the school was a convent for the St. Louis nuns, who taught Jack and Gerard and many other students over many years. In order to get to this school, Gerard and Jack had to pass the public Greenhalgh School, where their Protestant counterparts attended. This is not the original building, but this is the stone marker of the Greenhalgh School. Jack would later recount how the nuns at St. Louis would tell their students that the youngsters at the Greenhalgh, not being Catholics, had tails under their trousers, which I, for one, believed, as Jack put it. And then, on June the 2nd, 1926, Gerard Kerouac died in this house following an excruciatingly painful battle with rheumatic fever. His wake was also held in the Boyer Street home, and his funeral was at the St. Louis Church. Gerard Kerouac is buried in the St. Louis de Gonzague Cemetery in Nashua, New Hampshire. Perhaps it was the pain of living in the home where they had lost a son that led Leo and Gabrielle to move with their 2 children, Caroline called Nin and Jack called Tijon, to this home at 320 Hildreth Street. A year later, they moved a couple of blocks down the street to 240 Hildreth. Their stay here was also short-lived before they relocated again in 1929 for a comparatively long 3-year residency at 66 West Street. According to some of his biographers, this is the home where Jack began to have his first lasting memories of real events. It is also where he began to speak English, having known only French until the age of 6. While living on West Street, Jack left the St. Louis School and began attending the St. Joseph School, which is just across the street from the St. Jean-Baptiste Church, where Jack served as an altar boy. In order to get to this school, young Jack had to cross the Merrimack River by way of the Aiken Street Bridge, and the Merrimack River would later become the central image in much of his writings. The bridge shown here is a later version of the one young Jack crossed to get to St. Joseph's. On a small hill that rises just behind and above the houses of Centerville is this castle-like looking house at 19 Whitney Street. It certainly looked like a castle to the young Jack, whose rich imagination and capacity for fantasy were already taking shape. He imagined that this was the castle of Dr. Sax, an imaginary companion and hero who would banish evil from the world. Jack came to call this house the Snake Hill Castle of Dr. Sax. Years later, this figure of his childhood imagination would become the title for one of Kerouac's more enigmatic novels, Dr. Sax, and one in which he would recall his late childhood and early adolescence in Lowell. 66 West Street was the last home in Centerville where the Kerouacs would live. In 1932, they moved a mile or so up the Merrimack to another French-Canadian enclave, Pawtucketville, with their first home being this one at 16 Phoebe Avenue. In the years that followed, the Kerouacs lived in several Pawtucketville homes, all in fairly close proximity to each other. Kerouac's memories of these neighborhoods would form the basis for his novels Dr. Sax, Maggie Cassidy, and portions of Vanity of Douloureuse. After a few years on Phoebe Avenue, the Kerouacs moved around the corner to 35 Sarah Avenue. Jack would remember it in Dr. Sax through his 12-year-old eyes. My face now in the window of the Sarah Avenue house, 6 little houses on the entire dirt street. Even the streets and street corners of Pawtucketville left their impression on the young Jack. In the opening paragraphs of Dr. Sax, he recalls this street corner. The wrinkly tar corner I saw it, hauntingly, Riverside Street, as it ran across Moody Street, now University Avenue, and into the fabulously rich darkness of Sarah Avenue. And this little stretch of Gershom Street gets portrayed in Dr. Sax in this way. I was coming down the hill between Gershom Avenue and that spectral street where Billy Artaud used to live. From Pawtucketville, Jack took frequent trips across the Merrimack to the more central parts of Lowell, often with his mother, and they would cross the Moody Street Bridge to visit his Uncle Joseph, Aunt Caroline, and his cousins, all of whom had moved down from Nashua following the Depression, where Joseph lost his Nashua grocery store. On these trips, Jack and his mother would often visit the grotto, just a few blocks north of the Moody Street Bridge, and patterned after the grotto at Lourdes. Here they would make the Stations of the Cross, culminating at the large crucifix that overlooks the entire grotto, and with the steps leading up to it that one is supposed to climb on his or her knees. As Jack tells it, my mother kneeled, prayed, and worked a step up the cross mount to show me how some people did it all the way up to the foot of the cross itself. In Dr. Sax, Kerouac writes of seeing a funeral home behind the first station of the cross with the drapes in the window, showing where the funeral director himself lives in his house of death. As will be seen later, this passage comes to have an eerie and haunting significance. The grotto is located behind the Franco-American School, which was an orphanage when Kerouac and his mother visited the grotto. Jack would write of seeing Dr. Sax flit from the station with his cape now hanging from the orphan home. One of the pivotal events in Dr. Sax takes place when Jack describes the night he and his mother returned from visiting Uncle Joseph's family and went back over the Moody Street Bridge on an August night when the moon was the moon of death. A man walking in front of them and carrying a watermelon under his arm suddenly dropped dead. It was Jack's first encounter with death, apart from the death of Gerard, of which he had little, if any, conscious memory. Kerouac writes of the watermelon man. His eyes turned glassy on the milky waters. It was that part of the giant rocks below he chose to die with his gaze fixed on. These rampaging waters, especially as they ran under the Moody Street Bridge, are a recurring image in Kerouac's Lowell novels, particularly as he describes them, again in Dr. Sachs, in the Great Flood of 1936, when he was 14 years old. It was also while living in Pawtucketville that Jack began attending the Bartlett School in Lowell after completing the 5th grade at St. Joseph's. Going to the Bartlett marked Kerouac's first break with his exclusively Catholic education and took him out of the predominantly French-Canadian neighborhoods where he'd always lived. It was while going to school here that he first met Sebastian Sammy Sampas, who would become his close friend and soulmate on through their high school years. From the Bartlett School, Jack went on to Lowell High School. By now, his family had moved to the top floor of this tenement at 736 Moody Street. At that time, the tenement was built over a diner called the Textile Lunch, and in Maggie Cassidy, Jack would describe the smells as they came from this diner. What was the Textile Lunch, after numerous reincarnations, is now a Lowell police substation. This home is the one Kerouac would return to after his late-night visits with his high school romance with Mary Carney. As later told in his novel, Maggie Cassidy, Mary Carney lived in an Irish neighborhood in South Lowell. Just across the street from 736 Moody is the Pawtucketville Social Club. Jack's father, Leo, managed this club for a time, and this is where Jack and his friends would shoot pool. Lowell High School represents both Kerouac's ties to Lowell and his ticket out of Lowell as well. He came into his own here as a football and track player and sharpened his intellect and creativity in his conversations with Sammy Sampas and with a group of aspiring writers, artists, and intellectuals who called themselves the Young Prometheans. In his senior year of high school, Jack spent a good deal of his time here, instead of in class, at the Lowell Public Library, now called the Pollard Memorial Library. His intellect and creativity did not fit well into the regimen of high school, and he chose a self-education route instead at his local library. Jack Kerouac graduated with the class of 1939 at Lowell High School, after which his world moved well beyond Lowell. His athletic prowess earned him a football scholarship to Columbia University by way of Horace Mann Prep School, so he was off to New York. But just as he could not adapt to the regimen of high school, neither did he do so in college. He left Columbia to work in a gas station in Hartford, Connecticut, at the same time that his mother and father relocated to New Haven, Connecticut. There was, however, one more Kerouac family home in Lowell. When his parents moved back to Lowell, to this house at 125 Crawford Street, just one block over from Moody Street, Jack left the gas station in Hartford to join them. And while he writes of this return to Lowell and to this house in sentimental and romantic tones in his novel Vanity of Douloureuse, the return itself was short-lived. After a brief stint of writing for the Lowell Sun, Jack decided he was indeed finished with Lowell and left to return to New York for a run with the United States Merchant Marine as part of the World War II effort. His parents also moved back to the Richmond Hill section of Queens, New York, where Leo died in 1946. In truth, however, Kerouac was never finished with Lowell and with the rhythms of life he discovered in its neighborhood and its streets, its mills and canals, and of course the Merrimack River. In 1950, after the publication of his first novel, The Town and the City, Jack came back to the Bon Marché store for a signing. But this beautifully written book did not fare all that well when it came to sales. In 1954, Kerouac made another trip to Lowell, with his life and spirits at a low ebb, and with his hopes for a literary career seemingly on permanent hold. On this trip, he stepped into the St. Jean d'Arc Church in his old Pawtucketville neighborhood. By now, he had become quite taken with the study and practice of Buddhism, while never abandoning his Catholic roots. While sitting in this church, in a spirit of prayer and meditation, Kerouac, as he would later tell it, made the connection in his mind and spirit between beat and beatitude, saying that being beat really meant living as simply and compassionately as one could, and trying to emulate the lives and the teachings of both Jesus and the Buddha. Those who know the story of Kerouac's life know where it goes from here. The publication of On the Road in 1957 brought him the recognition he desired, but it also brought him a lot of unwanted and undeserved notoriety as well. Even as his many novels came to be published, his life went into a gradual and tragic alcoholic decline as the 1960s moved along. This decline was foreshadowed in his novel, Big Sur. It all led Jack back to Lowell in 1967 and to this house at 271 Sanders Street in Lowell's Highlands section. Prior to this move, Jack had married Stella Sampas, the older sister of his high school soulmate Sammy, and with whom Jack had kept in touch over the years since he left Lowell. Sammy Sampas tragically lost his life in the Second World War at Anzio Beach while serving as a medic in a non-combatant role. Stella, Jack, and Jack's mother Gabrielle, who by now had suffered a stroke, lived in this house, with many of Stella's family members, Kerouac's Sampas in-laws, living nearby. During this time, Jack often frequented his brother-in-law's bar, Nicky's, at this location, which now houses a restaurant, and the Sack Club with his friend, a local historian and English professor, the late J. Pendergast. It was also while living at 271 Sanders that Kerouac wrote the last novel he would see published in his lifetime, Vanity of Douloureuse. But even now, Lowell could not hold him. Largely at his mother's urging, Jack, Stella, and Gabrielle left 271 Sanders in September of 1968 to live in St. Petersburg, Florida, where Jack and Gabrielle had lived previously. Just over a year later, on October the 21st, 1969, Jack Kerouac died of liver failure in a St. Petersburg hospital at age 47. Jack Kerouac came back to Lowell for one final time. His wake was held at the Archambault Funeral Home, the same funeral home he'd seen as a boy and had mysteriously wondered about from behind that first station of the cross at the grotto. His funeral was held at the St. Jean-Baptiste Church, where he had once been an altar boy. Among the pallbearers who carried his casket down these steps were Allen Ginsberg, his brother-in-law Tony Sampas, his cousin Harvey Kerouac, and his Lowell friends Joe Chaput and Billy Comensales. The casket was taken to the Edson Cemetery and laid to rest on this site in the Sampas family plot, next to his dear friend Sammy. In February of 1990, Stella Sampas Kerouac died and was buried next to her husband. By the time of Stella's death, Lowell was coming around to recognizing and honoring its native son. In 1988, the Kerouac commemorative was dedicated in the Eastern Canal Park. The inscriptions on its smooth marble structures draw on his road novels and his Lowell novels and show his Catholic roots as well as the Buddhism he came to embrace for a time. A few years after the dedication of the commemorative, the entire park in which it is built was renamed Kerouac Park. Out of the energies that went into the planning and building the commemorative came the Lowell Celebrates Kerouac Committee, which puts on a joyous annual Jack Kerouac Festival every October, which Jack considered his favorite month. In the mid-90s, the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, with the support of the Kerouac estate and the management of Professor Hilary Holliday, began a biannual Jack Kerouac Conference on Beat Literature and initiated a Kerouac Writers Program. In October of 2004, Lowell High School, in a special recognition ceremony, named Jack Kerouac as one of its distinguished alumni. And following a March 12, 2005 governor's proclamation of Jack Kerouac Day in Massachusetts, his number 9 Lupine Road home was given official recognition as his birth site. In May of 2001, Mr. James Irsay of Indianapolis, Indiana, purchased at Christie's auction the original 120-foot scroll manuscript of Kerouac's On the Road, and subsequently arranged for it to be exhibited in various sites around the United States. During the summer of 2007, at the Boot Cotton Mills Museum of the Lowell National Historical Park, this document, for which Mr. Irsay paid $2.4 million, will be on exhibit for 3 months for its only New England showing. Just as persons young and old have flocked to see this manuscript at its other exhibition sites, Now those living in and around Jack Kerouac's hometown have their opportunity to view the original version of this marvelous piece of work. So while Kerouac does indeed belong to Lowell, he also belongs to all of those who have been touched and blessed by his writings. His true legacy is in these books and all the inspiration they have given to their millions of readers. The eternal qualities of Jack Kerouac will always be contained and held up in these gifts of his to American literature and to the world.